Welcome to my Paint With Me video. Today I'm going to be making this very simple beginner level wildflower landscape in watercolor. I thought it would be a nice piece to share in case anyone wanted to try making their own watercolor landscape with me, or even make it into a nice card for Mother's Day. Either way, I'm just going to dive right in, so let's get started. In terms of supplies, you will need a hard, thick paper, preferably watercolor paper, but if you don't happen to have that lying around, a cardstock or even any other thick paper could work just fine, although many papers will warp when you put water on them, so just keep that in mind. Next, you will need a cup of water, a set of watercolors, some colorful pens, a watercolor brush or set, pair of scissors, glue, and a ruler. I also decided to use some scrap paper with pretty prints on them for the inside of my card as well, but you can use anything that you might have lying around the house to decorate the inside, or you can just leave it blank. And you will also lastly need some masking tape. Okay, so the first step is to measure your paper. I took a 1-inch piece off the side because I wanted to use it for the inside to make some popped lettering. But ultimately you will fold your paper in half. Mine was so thick I used a hard surface to bend the paper over. And I put a piece of cardboard over the other half of the page, which is the back of the card, just to protect it while I work. And then we're ready to set up our colors. I'm using this photo as my reference and guide. I just thought it was so beautiful and has kind of a nice color scheme that my mom would appreciate. So I'm going to be trying to really replicate this colors within it as closely as I possibly can. The main thing to consider is that watercolors look best when you add other colors to them rather than just taking the colors from the palette itself. When you mix your own, it gives it more of a real dynamic look. So I spent some serious time getting my colors right, adding in some different reds and yellows to get the right orange, adding in some different blues or reds to get that nice vibrant purple that I was looking for. Okay, so once we get our colors all done and mixed, before we start painting, I want to make a border so that we have that nice clean edge around our painting. So grab your masking tape and create a border with a width that you're happy with. I used 1/2 inch here. Seemed appropriate with the size of my paper. Now to start painting, something to keep in mind is that when painting with watercolors, you want to go from light colors to dark colors. So basically, less pigmented colors to more pigmented colors. So I find it really helpful to make your background first and to make it much lighter than what your detail will be, which you will add on top of your background as it dries. This is a very helpful tip with watercolors. I like to put more pigment at the top where the definition of hills are, and then keep adding water to get that blended effect down at the bottom. Now, another important thing is to add any other color to this while it's wet. This is called wet on wet technique, and it's what's going to create that nice bloom of color where those patches of wildflowers seem to be on my reference photo. Okay, and as this starts to dry, my brush strokes will start to add more of that pigmented detail as there's less water for the pigment to work with. So here I'm just dabbing my brush around to create a more detailed patch of flowers in the distance. Next, I start the second half of my painting, which is my foreground in this case. I find that working with watercolor in batches creates a much more relaxing experience. If I had decided to try and do my entire background at once, I may have felt a race against time with the background drying too quickly for me to get to all of it before my paint marks started to show more details rather than that blended effect that I was talking about. Working in batches really helps to remedy that rushed feeling. So for this last hill, which is my foreground, I chose a more orange background because that's ultimately what my reference photo called for, and also a patch of purple and even a little bit of green. Again, while my background is wet, I can decide to add different colors and also add more pigment to create more definition while still having that blooming effect. So as that dries, I can go up to my top section where I did my first batch of hills because it's now dry, and I can make some adjustments and add in some more color. Watercolors tend to look much bolder when wet and become more muted when dry, so it's always good to let things dry to see if you really got the color that you were looking for vibrant enough. Here I decide to add a little more orange and even a little more gray, as my reference photo actually seems to have a lot of gray in the middle hill here. I can also see some parts where those hills come together, and I think the green would add that detail quite nicely. Now that's all looking pretty good to me, and my lower hill is dry now, so I can really go in and add in all of that detail. I use a dot effect here to give those patches a little bit more texture to resemble actual flowers in the foreground. And I keep going with those dots until I feel satisfied that some depth of field is being created. Now what I'm going to add is some of the green grass and stems and leaves of the poppies in my reference photo. So instead of dots, I'm going to use little lines to create that different texture, and then go back with some orange to create the tops of my poppies. Add some more texture where I see fit, and then I'm going to let that dry and check back in with how it looks. I find that sometimes stepping away from an art piece and then coming back to it gives you a fresher perspective on what you might want to change or take away. I see that a little bit more definition of my front hill is necessary to really make it pop and seem closer, so I add that in. Although, as I keep looking, I'm feeling like my patches are a little too plain and look a little blocky with just one color. So I want to kind of mix in some other colors to give it more of that natural and real look of a wildflower landscape, with the wildflowers more mixed in with each other. So I add in some purple over orange, or orange over purple, or even more orange over green to really get those California poppies to pop. And at this point, I really like what I'm seeing, and I think it turned out pretty well. I think it looks actually more similar to my reference photo than I thought it would, so that was an unexpected surprise. So it's time to take off the tape and see what we've really got. And wow, it really comes to life with that border around it. I think this is going to make a great Mother's Day card. I'm very, very happy with how this looks. I think it's beautiful. Definitely a beginner piece, but I'm surprised with how well the colors turned out. I think my restraint to mess with those back hills more was a good idea. I like how loose and blended they look behind that more detailed and textured hill in the foreground. So now I can move on to the inside of my card. So what I decided to do here was take the little strip that I cut out earlier, but it can be any cute little piece of scrap paper you might have, and write in big, bold font, Happy Mother's Day. I want this part to pop and be really eye-catching, so I use my thick black pen and even make my letters thicker and extra bold. Then I take my pieces of scrap paper and use them to make a cornered outline around my letters. This leaves the other side of the card blank to write a really sweet note in, and I'll use colored pens for that just to make it, again, really colorful next to those black letters. Okay, next I'm going to want to glue everything down, and I chose to stick a piece of wax paper over my glued pieces and then set some really heavy books on top to both flatten the watercolor paper and set the glue. Once that is done, I think we've got a wonderful finished piece. Look at that. Now I just need to write in my words for my mother and it's all ready to go, but I'm really happy with it. I think it looks really, really good. Thank you so much for watching, and if you joined in to create your own Mother's Day card or even your own painting of a California landscape, then I'd love to see your results. Thanks for joining me in this process, and have a lovely Mother's Day.